But so we got to figure out how to install that. People with input.
Yeah, it's counting down. Very happy Tuesday evening. Here we are to a ham radio upgrade class. If you already have your technician amateur radio license in the United States and would like to upgrade to the general class, the intermediate level, that's what we're all about here. And we're on chapter 2, point in the right direction, of this book. This is the American Radio Relay League's license manual for the general class, the 10th edition. That's the one you want. It's got the current question pool. And what we do is we go chapter by chapter each week in this book, with the exception of being next chapter, chapter 4. We'll tell you more about that coming up. And in the back of the book are all of the questions and all of the answers that would be on your 35-question multiple choice test. Of course, if you're watching us, you already have your technician license. You've already gone through this for your technician, taking a multiple choice test and getting your ham radio license. But the HF bands are ahead. And those are the most wonderful things to operate on and to use. So we're excited about getting you up into the general space on the amateur radio bands. I'm Gary. Ham radio call sign, Whiskey 4 Echo Echo Yankee, and I'll be your instructor this evening. So tonight is chapter 3. Did I say chapter 2? Chapter 3, Rules and Regulations. There are 4 sections in this chapter. We'll go through the first 2. We'll take a 5-minute break and then come back and do the last 2 sections in the book. So we're going to start out with regulatory agencies. And the first one is the big one, who's in charge of all civilian telecommunications activities worldwide, and that's the International Telecommunications Union. The ITU is a part of the United Nations, though they are based in Geneva, Switzerland. And rather than me telling you about them, let's have them tell us about themselves.
ITU members connect the world. The ITU family is growing, ever more diverse, to deliver on the promise of the digital economy. With 193 member states and more than 900 members, from leading companies to SMEs, in areas as diverse as telecoms, internet, broadcast, satellite, software, artificial intelligence, fintech, utilities, automotive, smart cities, to regulators, universities, R&D institutions, international and regional organizations. ITU members come from every corner of the globe. Africa, Americas, Arab states, Asia and the Pacific, Commonwealth of Independent States, Europe, and regional and international. Nowhere else in the world will you find such a rich and diverse network of experts and leaders in the global ICT ecosystem. So what are you waiting for? Become a member. Go to www.itu.int/join.
Okay, well, you don't actually have to become a member of the ITU. You are a member probably of your local national organization, the ARRL, for example, here in the United States, and they participate with the ITU. So you're already kind of associated. I wanted to point out that they have a YouTube channel of their own with a lot of videos that are available for you to take a look at, so the URL is down below. And they also, of course, have a web page. And so if you'd like to find out more information about the ITU, the International Telecommunications Union, here's the information you need. All right, so that's overarching over all civilian telecommunications activities in the world. In the amateur radio space, there's also an international organization. the International Amateur Radio Union, or IARU. And they've put together a video about themselves as well, so let's take a listen.
Your volume is very...
Thanks. All right, so that's the International Amateur Radio Union. We did have a comment by someone in the Zoom classroom that my mic audio went down. It may have been due to something called original sound that Zoom has. When I play music, it interprets it as tones and sometimes mutes things. Can you hear me okay now in the Zoom classroom? Just give me a thumbs up.
You're still really low. The audio's low.
Still really low. Can you bring me up at all anymore, Bruce? Mic 1, there?
Yeah.
Okay. So, is that better?
Much better, much better.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. So, here is the URL for the International Amateur Radio Union, IARU. And as you saw, they sit in on the ITU meetings as a sector partner. So, our national organization, I mentioned earlier, the ARRL, or American Radio Relay League, we encourage you to become a member because they're the only one that lobbies on our behalf with Congress here in the United States. And yes, too, they have a video.
Amateur radio, also known as ham radio, is a popular service and hobby that enables so many activities, from public service to scientific experimentation to sheer fun. With more than 740,000 practitioners in the U.S. and 1.75 million worldwide, there are federally licensed amateur radio operators everywhere, in your neighborhood, in your workplace, and in your schools. People just like you use ham radio to communicate without relying on the internet or a cell phone network. And it can go wherever you go. You can hike a trail, climb a mountain, or paddle a river and take your radio with you. Ham radio even reaches as far as outer space. Ham radio operators can talk to astronauts aboard the International Space Station, talk to other operators through satellites orbiting Earth, and even bounce their radio signals off the moon and back. The amateur radio service is a valued element of neighborhoods and municipalities across the U.S. In times of disaster, when regular communications channels fail, the amateur radio service works with public service agencies such as FEMA, the American Red Cross, and the Salvation Army to assist emergency communications efforts. Amateurs can also use their radios to volunteer within their communities, providing communications for events like county fairs, parades, and road races. Although people get involved with amateur radio for many reasons, they all pass a test to earn the Federal Communications Commission license that shows they have a basic knowledge of the principles of electricity, radio technology, and operating rules. This knowledge has practical everyday applications that educators have used to teach science, technology, engineering, and math concepts. Lots of hams got into the hobby as kids and followed their interest in radio to exciting careers as astronauts, engineers, pilots, and more. The ham radio frequencies begin below the AM broadcast band and extend into extremely high microwave frequencies. Ham radio operators use these frequencies to communicate with each other using microphones, Morse code, and even by interfacing a radio with a computer or tablet to send data, text, or images. Some compete in contests, trying to make the most radio contacts within a certain time frame. Amateur radio has been around for over 100 years, and the technology behind it continues to evolve and advance today. Operators are always finding new ways to explore amateur radio, experimenting with digital applications of this technology through things like coding, mobile apps, and drones. To learn more about the endless possibilities of amateur radio, where the technology is headed, and how you can get involved, visit ARRL, the National Association for Amateur Radio, at www.arrl.org.
Okay, so that was a little bit about ARRL, and they are a membership organization of amateur radio operators in the United States, but they also have members worldwide. So if you're outside of the United States, you still can become a member of the ARRL and get access to their various resources, including their publications, which you can probably most easily read online. They have all of their publications now being published as PDFs that you can get through their website. So that's ARRL. The granddaddy, or the big boss here in the United States, is the Federal Communications Commission. It's our Ministry of Posts and Telecommunications, and the FCC is in charge of all civilian telecommunications activities in the United States. Now, they've got their hands full because they regulate cellular carriers, satellite operators, broadcast operators, land mobile service, all sorts of different things. But amateur radio has its own section in the rules and regulations of the FCC, Part 97. And there's a URL down below that will take you to the Part 97 rules that you can download as a PDF, and then find out everything that we're telling you here in class is largely based on these rules. Now the question is, who enforces these regulations? It used to be the FCC had their own enforcement arm, but because of funding and other priorities, nowadays the band police, also known as the volunteer monitors, are the ones that kind of police ourselves. Volunteer monitors are a joint venture between the ARRL and the FCC. There used to be something called the Official Observer Program. That went away, and now there are at least 250 volunteer monitors with at least 5 in each ARRL section. They get training from the ARRL, and then if rule violations occur and are noted by the volunteer monitors, they will inform ARRL, who will send out a notice from them to let you know that, oops, we observed you operating out of band at this time, please cease and desist. That's hams helping other hams. It fosters a wider knowledge and a better compliance with the FCC rules. Notice the blue text here. It supports the concepts of self-regulation in the amateur service. And so it allows us to keep things in check and not so unruly. Not to say that you won't hear some things on the bands that you go, what is that all about? Remember, we have the big knob. You can always QSY and go on to a quieter space. So that's the FCC. If you wanted to know more about the Volunteer Monitor Program that between the ARRL and the FCC, here is a web page that you can actually volunteer. I think you can put your name in if you'd like to do that. Now, one thing that is the bane of local repeater operators, for example, are situations where you might have a stuck microphone and a transmitter is keying on all the time. Or in really difficult cases, we have a juvenile ham radio operator, and I mean juvenile up here, not in age, who is causing problems on the repeater. They might use something like this. Does anybody know what that device up at the top is all about? You can unmute and just let me know. What do you think it is?
Direction finder.
It is. It's a direction finding system. And so with something like this, or even directional Yagi antennas at your home station, and now with computer aided applications like SIGTRAX, you can put in these bearings over Google Maps or some other mapping, and it's relatively easy to narrow down where interfering signals, such as a stuck microphone, might be coming from. So just keep that in mind. Another regulating agency that we don't always think about is the FAA. Well, Gary, I'm not going to fly a plane and I'm not going to take my radio in a plane, but you might put up a tower. And a tower could be an obstruction to aviation. And so the FAA gets involved with amateur radio operators. Now, the rule is that towers under 200 feet are okay without special permission as long as you're approximately 4 miles away from a public airport. If it's going to be higher than 200 feet, you may need to paint or light the tower and or register it with the FAA so they can make sure it's noted on maps. And if you'd like to know more about lighting requirements for towers, this deals more with commercial towers, but flash technology were one of the first folks that ever came out with the white strobe lights for broadcast towers. And they have an excellent webpage here which talks about the details and requirements for obstruction lighting for towers. And here's the long and the short of it, so to speak. If you're near, let me put on a laser pointer here. There we go. So if you're near a long runway, but you're at least 4 miles away or 20,000 feet away, you can still go ahead and put your antenna up at 200 feet. If you're closer, well, then there's a formula that you're going to have to derate the height of the maximum tower that you can put up. If you're near a heliport or a short runway, well, then there's some additional information here about that. So know where the nearest airport is to you and what the obstructions might be around you. If you're going to put up a tower, there's always something else that you're going to have to consider, and that are local government and zoning ordinances in your area. Do they require permits before putting up a tower? That's a question you need to find out. And if you're in a neighborhood that has a homeowners association, did they make you sign covenants and conditions when you bought your homes? CCRs are the bane of amateur radio. Now, at the moment, there's nothing that we can do. Now, with local zoning, there is something. FCC Rule PRB1, it impacts local and state regulations on amateur radio. And here, local governments are required to, here's the quote, reasonably accommodate amateur radio installations. So even if you are required to go through a permitting process, they need to deal with you. They can't just say, no, no towers. No. The local government agencies have to help you out. Now, before Congress, things are changing in Washington right now, and I'm, optimistic. There is something called the Amateur Radio Emergency Preparedness Act. And there's a URL here down at the bottom, which you can click on tomorrow when you get the PDF in our handout folder. ARRL is working with Congress to have this legislation go through. And among the other provisions, the legislation would prohibit homeowners association rules that would prevent or ban amateur radio antennas. It would specify an approval process and then provide a federal private right of action to amateur radio operators in case of dispute. It's House Resolution 1094. So if you're political and would like to let your congressman know that you support 1094, go ahead and take a look at it first, read through it, get all the details, and then if you agree, well, you might let them know. It could happen that we would actually get some special consideration, especially after Hurricane Helene and the other natural disasters in California, that we might see the blooming of 1,000 towers across the land. Wouldn't that be beautiful? Okay, beauty's in the eye of the beholder, but all right. I mentioned at the start the International Telecommunications Union. That's the global agency for coordinating civilian telecommunications. They're based in Geneva, Switzerland, and so they have divided the Earth up into 3 regions. Region 1, centered on, where the ITU was located, Europe, is Europe and Africa. Region 2 is North, Central, and South America, including Greenland. And then Region 3, Oceania, the Pacific, Australia, and Asia. So we are here in the United States in Region 2. Why is that important in amateur radio? Well, some bands, specifically the 160 meter, 80 meter, and 40 meter bands, have different allocations depending on which ITU region you are in, which is why you will sometimes hear DX stations calling single sideband very low in the band and say that they are listening very high in the band. They're trying to get around or work with these limitations to be able to make DX contacts with the United States because we might not be able to transmit down where they are. So keep these in mind. Also, U.S. possessions outside of the continental United States, think about Alaska and Hawaii, for example, they have privileges to operate where the rest of the U.S. Cannot, because they're right there in Region 3. And also Guam, the Marianas, those have special considerations. And here's the details on it. I won't necessarily go into it, but here's the bottom line. Some FCC-regulated amateur stations can operate on frequencies that are different than those used by amateur stations in the continental United States, and that's because of this ITU regioning and the difference in those bands. All right, come back to me just for a second, Bruce. I've been involved, in fact, I had to think about this for a while, in remotely operating my amateur radio station since about 2015. I was living at a house in Greenville, South Carolina, in an HOA neighborhood, but they didn't have restrictions on antennas. But they did have a heck of a lot of RF noise. Plasma TVs, all that other stuff. It was just horrible for amateur radio, especially on the HF bands. But I was fortunate and blessed, and we were able to buy a mountain house, a vacation house. And so I located my ham radio station to the mountain house. And then it's a Flex radio, and back at that time, Flex was really not supporting remote operation, but a bunch of hams were getting involved in virtual private networks and figuring out ways that they could use their Flex radios remotely. So I've been doing it, since that time. And here, even at my house right now, I'm operating remote from my office ham shack to my radio in my garage. It's remote via LAN, if you take the laptop there. So this is a picture of my HF operating location. I have the Flex controller, which is called the Maestro, right here. I'm monitoring my amplifier and RF kit S, some additional information here, logging software. So this is my HF operating position in my office. And out in a storeroom in my garage is my radio. On the right there is the 6600, and on the left is the RF kit S amplifier. So remote control is a thing, and it's something that you can get involved in, and you can remotely control your own station. You can go in with a group of other hams to remotely control stations. You can actually there are commercial entities now where you can rent time on amateur radio stations. So we need to know about remote control. The interesting thing is, I'll tell you about my setup is when I was operating in Greenville. I was really afraid that people at the other end of the communication would know that I was operating remote and call me out on it. And so I would make it a point to tell them, hey, I'm operating remote. Oh, I'm operating remote. And you know what the answer was that I got back every time? I couldn't tell. It works. It works very well, and you really can't tell. The only thing you might have to worry about is delays in timing by traversing the internet. You don't know how long that's going to take. It's called latency, and it is something you might need to know about. But if you think you want to get involved with remote control operation of a ham radio station, know that if the transmitter is in the USA, then FCC rules apply. So your German friend would need to have an FCC amateur license in order to operate your station here in the United States, or have reciprocal authority. That's the other thing. If the transmitter you want to control is outside of the United States, then local government rules apply there. So if you've got a friend that's got a station in Central America, well, you've got to find out what the requirements are at that country there. And always third-party rules. Remember that from the technician class? There are some countries that will allow you to have direct ham-to-ham communications, but the minute you bring in somebody else, a third party, you can't pass messages from that third party because of the old phone regulations, the Post and Telecommunications. When long-distance calls were so expensive, the internet has blown that all away, but the rules still apply. So these are the three things you need to know about remote control. Oh, three things. That sounds like an all of the above. Speaking of questions, let's see how we do. So if you're in the Zoom classroom, you can go ahead and unmute and give me your answers. And remember our 3-second rule. We'd like you to pause 3 seconds before you come out with your answer, because that gives the folks who are watching on YouTube or watching a delay a chance to formulate it before you get the answer out. We want everybody to learn. So here's the first question. What is the maximum height above ground for an antenna structure not near a public use airport? Charlie is correct, 200 feet. And under what conditions are state and local governments permitted to regulate amateur radio antenna structures?
Delta.
Remember the phrase reasonably accommodated. Amateur service communications must be reasonably accommodated. And when operating a U.S. station by remote control from outside the country, what license is required of the control operator? I heard it. Yes, yeah. Alpha. Yeah, it's Alpha if a U.S. operator or primary station license is required. So when operating a station in South America by remote control over the internet from the U.S., what regulations apply? Yeah, those of the remote station's country. The frequency allocations of which ITU region apply to radio amateurs operating in North and South America? Yeah, we are in Region 2. And what is the Volunteer Monitor Program?
Alpha.
Yeah, they're amateur volunteers who are formally enlisted to monitor the airwaves for rule violations, and they do undertake training for that. So which of the following are objectives of the Volunteer Monitor Program?
Delta.
I want to give everybody a chance to read, but yes, it is Delta, to encourage amateur radio operators to self-regulate and comply with the rules. So what procedure may be used by volunteer monitors to localize a station whose continuous carrier is holding a repeater on in their area? Yeah, we talked about radio direction finding. One way is to compare beam headings on the repeater input frequency from their home locations. All right, excellent. On to section 3.2. Back in the olden golden days, the FCC used to license amateur radio operators directly. And if you're a member of a local amateur radio club, probably some of the old timers there could tell you stories about when they had to go to the FCC office and take their ham radio test. I'm from Michigan originally, and this was the Detroit field office. Had the golden doors on the outside, and you walked in and you were already very intimidated. Now, I never took my amateur radio license here, but I did take my my commercial radio telephone license test here at the FCC in Detroit. And it looked kind of like this, really. It was one of these old offices with, clerks and typists and everybody all around. And they brought you into this barren room, which just had a bunch of these. The crummy wooden desks that you sat down at, and you had to sit there, and in many cases, you had to listen for Morse code because it was a requirement back then. Well, that was hard to hear in this echoey room, but okay. Or you had to take your test, and in my case, I took it with a slide rule, and you had to draw pictorials of various oscillator circuits and things like that. Okay, that all changed in 1984. And then the National Council of Volunteer Exam Coordinators was created. There are 14 VECs, Volunteer Examiner Coordinators. The American Radio Relay League is one of those. Here in South Carolina, the West Carolina Amateur Radio Service is very active in our area. But here are the other ones, W5YI, another one. Want you to keep in mind the VEC, or the Volunteer Exam Coordinator, is an organization. The Volunteer Examiner is one of those 3 people at least that are going to give you your upgrade test when you go to your exam session. So VEC is the organization, like WestCars, WCAR, or I don't know, anyway, WestCars, and the VE is an examiner like Dave Ivey, who might be your examiner. So the volunteer examiners must have accreditation by a VEC. Sometimes they take a test to become a VEC. Sometimes they have proof of licensing for a long period of time. So they're accredited by the VEC. They must have a license class above the grade that is being tested. The exception is the extra class, because there is no grade above extra class, but okay. If you had a volunteer examiner that had just a general class, they cannot give the extra class. They have to excuse themselves, and another examiner has to come in. There must be, as I mentioned, 3 VEs present during testing. There can be more. And they must be 18 years old. Those are the requirements to be a volunteer examiner. And you too can become a volunteer examiner. Can a non-U.S. citizen be a volunteer examiner? If they meet all of the other requirements that we just talked about, Yes. So my friend Matt, NU4E, who is a German citizen but living here in the United States, could be a volunteer examiner. So you're going to go after you take our class, you're going to go to your test session, you're going to sit down and you will pass your test, and you're going to be given a receipt. Well, it won't look like this. It'll look something like this. It's a certificate of successful completion of exam, also known as the CSCE. And it's valid for 1 year. Why would you want it to be valid for 1 year? Let's say they lose your paperwork. This is your receipt. This is your get out of jail free card that says, oh no, I took and passed the test. So this is proof that you passed. Now, nowadays, you get your new call sign, your upgrade or whatever in a matter of days. So this wasn't that important. But it was more important back before when you had to take a Morse code test and you had to take a separate written test. You could pass one and flunk the other, but this would help you so you could keep that and then take the other test within that 1 year period. So that's a CSCE. If you've had an expired license, or if your license expires, let's put it that way, there's a 2-year grace period where you can renew your license by just going to the FCC Universal Licensing System website and apply for renewal of your license. After that 2-year grace period, so it's 2025 now, if your license expired in 2023 and you didn't bother to update it, then the FCC will cancel your license. Now, if you can demonstrate that you have held a general, advanced, or extra class license and that it was not revoked, that's important, you can be reinstated by only passing the technician exam. So I don't know if that applies to anyone in our class now. I don't think so, but I've had inquiries about it. In that case, a new license and call sign will be issued by the FCC, and then if you wanted your old call sign back, you could apply for it under the Vanity Call Sign program. So when you go to take your test, and you will pass your test, you can immediately begin operating in the general portions of the band using your technician call sign with this appended to it, stroke AG or /AG. I think it stands for acting general, but nobody's ever really told me. So when you pass the general test, you can begin to operate in the general bands immediately, but you don't have to use this otherwise. If you're just going to be on the repeater or whatnot, you have full privileges with your technician license, so you just use your technician call sign, unless you want to brag, hey, I passed the test. So AG /AG. We are in the United States, and the national language is English. So the requirement is that if you're multilingual, you can carry on QSOs on the air in any language you want. But when it comes to IDs, you must ID your station in English. And of course, if you're on voice, then the phonetic alphabet is preferred. Whiskey 4, Echo, Echo, Yankee, for example. All right, let's answer some more questions. So, who may receive partial credit for the elements represented by an expired amateur radio license?
Alpha.
It is alpha. It was kind of an obscure one, but any person who can demonstrate that they once held an FCC-issued general, advanced, or amateur extra class license that was not revoked by the FCC can get it back just by taking the technician test. So what license examinations may you administer as an accredited volunteer examiner holding a general class operator license? Yeah, only the technician class, so the beginning license. On which of the following band segments may you operate if you are a technician class operator and have an unexpired certificate of successful completion of exam for general class privileges?
Charlie.
That's a really long-winded question, but yeah, you pass the exam. You are a general, so you can operate on any general or technician class band segment with the stroke AG. All right. Who must observe the administration of a technician class license examination?
Alpha.
At least 3 volunteer examiners. We said it had a minimum of 3. And for technician, it has to be general class or higher. You'll routinely find most VEs are extras. So until an upgrade to general class is shown in the FCC database, when must a technician licensee identify with AG after their call sign?
Alpha.
Well, the answers here are alpha, yeah. Whenever they operate using general class frequency privileges. We'll show some of those here coming up. Volunteer examiners are accredited by what organization?
Charlie.
The organization is the Volunteer Examiner Coordinator. Which of the following criteria must be met for a non-U.S. citizen to be an accredited volunteer examiner?
Bravo.
One of the requirements is that they must hold an FCC-granted amateur radio license of general class or above. So how long is a certificate of successful completion of exam valid for exam credit? I'm not sure I mentioned it, but yes, 1 year, 365 days. So what is the minimum age that one must be to qualify as an accredited VE? Have to be 18. And what action is required to obtain a new general class license after a previously held license has expired and the 2-year grace period has passed? Yeah, the applicant must show proof of the appropriate expired license grant and pass the current technician test or element 2 exam. All right, ladies and gentlemen, great job. You have made it to the intermission. So let's go ahead and take 5 minutes, get up and stretch, move around, and come back and we'll complete the last 2 sections. And by the way, rules and regulations, this chapter is your friend because there's not much math involved. All right, see you in 5 minutes.
So can I ask a question?
You just did.
Dave? Or Gary? So my question.
are back. Happy to have you with us. We're going to be concluding the last two sections in Chapter 3, Rules and Regulations. And next up are Control Operator Privileges and Rules. And your class of license, whether it's Technician, General, or Extra, has certain privileges. And nowhere is this more prevalent in the frequency allocations that we are given. And so this is something that the American Radio Relay League publishes, the frequency bands chart or the graphical frequency allocations chart. We call it the color chart. We've got them right here. They're printed on a very nice glossy paper. They're not laminated. You too could print them out. Here's the URL. You can go to the American Radio Relay League and download PDFs of this chart in various sizes and various orientations. Or if you'd like one of these, if you would just send me an email at w4eey@arrl.net. This is one of the benefits of being an ARRL member. They give you an email address that you can use that redirects to another email that you already have. So this is what I'm using it for, w4eey@arrl.net, and say, Gary, I would like one of the color charts. Oh, and here's my mailing address. I need the mailing address because I can't put this in the mail unless I have it. But we'll take care of that and get one out to you. And I can say we have sent out hundreds of these charts. No joke. It's amazing. But happy to do it. And the price is right. All right. Going back to your technician class training, if you were in my class or maybe a class locally there, you might remember this relationship. The relationship between frequency and wavelength. 300 there on the top is referencing 300 million meters per second, the speed of light. So that's what the 300 is all about. Frequency here in megahertz on the bottom, and wavelength in meters over here. And you know how you use these charts. You put your thumb over the one that you want to find. So let's say I want to find frequency. Well, then I know then 300 divided by the wavelength in meters will tell me the frequency. Or vice versa, if I want to find the wavelength, the 300 divided by the frequency in megahertz will give me the wavelength. So keep that in mind. That might be helpful as we go along and look at some of the amateur radio HF bands. Now, general class operators, that's you when you pass your exam, have full frequency privileges in the 160, 60, 30, 17, 12, and 10 meter bands. 6 bands. All of the World Administrative Radio Conference bands. You have full privileges, so there's no restrictions. But not on what I like to call the old-timers bands. The old-timers bands are 80, 40, 20, and 15. And on those bands, you will have limited privileges. So, Bruce, if we can go over to the color chart just for a second, which is on the calculator cam. Hopefully everybody can see this and it's not too glary. So this is the color chart, and it is in your book, but it's in a black and white form. And I guess I got to put my glasses on because I'm getting old. So I wanted to point out over here that the key off to the side, and I'm going to try to zoom in here. All right. Note that the red is radio teletype and data. Green is phone and image. This crosshatch is CW only. Single sideband phone is yellow. Blue is upper sideband phone. So here's the key for the color chart. And I want you to notice something about 30 meters. It's in red. Red means radio teletype and data. We're going to think about that for a second. Let's go on back over to the laptop. So which band is data only? Well, I just showed you. It's 30 meters. It's the band that's only in red. So keep that in mind. Voice applications, the most common kind of voice modulation on the HF bands is single sideband. Lower sideband routinely below 9 megahertz, upper sideband routinely above 9 megahertz. The exception is 60 meters, which is upper sideband. But okay, image. Dave touched on this earlier. Slow scan TV. Slow scan TV is transmitted using audio tones from a converter through the microphone input of your radio. And you can set the radio for either lower sideband or upper sideband mode. But slow scan TV is really a voice mode because you're using the microphone input and sending it as a single sideband signal. So here's a trick question. Okay, I think SSTV is a data mode, isn't it? No. Can you send slow scan TV on 30 meters? We just looked at 30 meters, and it's a data only band. Now here's the subdivision of it. All modes except phone, so you cannot send slow scan TV on 30 meters. That's not allowed. Just keep that in mind. If anybody came here from the CB world, I used to work at a Radio Shack store when I was very, very young. It was one of my first jobs, and we sold CB radios similar to this. Of course, they had their own brand, the Realistic brand name, and 40 channel CBs. Those were a hot item back in the day, and you know, CBers changed from frequency to frequency by going click, 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 click. You know, channel 1, channel 2, channel 3. Well, shades of channelized operation, normally in amateur radio we have the big knob, and we can tune to anywhere in the band that we want. 60 meters. Remember I said that was an exception? Well, 60 meters has channels. Channels that are 2.8 kilohertz wide at maximum. And you can see here the indicated frequency of where the carrier would be. And for voice use, upper sideband is required in 60 meters. And on the color chart, in the very little fine print, you'll find all of these details. 60 meters is also the only band where we deal with effective radiated power. Broadcasters, when they get a license to transmit, it's in effective radiated power. They take into account the transmitter output power and antenna gain. Well, in amateur radio, generally we are just concerned with transmitter output power or amplifier output power, no more than 1,500 watts, except 60 meters. The restriction is 100 watts from your transmitter to a dipole antenna. So the dipole antenna is set as the standard. And if you have, for 60 meters, an antenna that has gain over a dipole, then you have to reduce your transmitter power accordingly so that you're all playing at the same power level. So 100 watts PEP to a dipole with a maximum bandwidth, as I mentioned, 2.8 kilohertz. That's the 60 meter band. Kind of unusual. If you look at the 80 meter band on your color chart, and notice up above I call it the 80/75 meter band. This is a very wide amateur radio band such that the top end up here is actually, the wavelength is closer to 75 meters than it is to 80. Down here, 80 it's closer, but so this is the 80 meter and the 75 meter, and you'll hear the nomenclature being used interchangeably. What I want you to notice also are these things right here. This N and T, which stands for novice and technician. And if you remember this pattern, this is Morse code only. So novice licensees, there are still some out there that renew every year, and technician class licensees have high frequency privileges for Morse code here in the 80-meter band. So you can begin to operate HF with a technician license right now, as long as it's Morse code. Now, above that, GAE, General, Advanced, Extra class. So you see Extra class has full privileges on the band. Advanced class has most of the frequencies available, but with a gap here. Most of the frequencies down here with a gap. Generals have the least allocation. Bigger gap here, gap here. This is what the FCC originally called incentive licensing. They wanted to give hams an incentive to upgrade. In some countries, like the United Kingdom, the incentive is power. Power levels go up as you increase your class of license. In the United States, it's frequency privileges on the old-timers bands. So if you're looking at the color chart and you see this EAGNT at the side, that's what it's talking about. Now, I'll give you a hint. Maybe not so much on 80 meters, but on 40 meters and on 20 meters, this gap down here, or this bigger gap here, is important, because in many cases that's where the rare DX lives. That's where the DX stations actually will set up there, and you go, I want to work them down there. Wait, I can't. I don't have frequency privileges there. So that's 80 meters, 80 and 75. Here's 40 meters. And remember, we talked about that some locations outside the continental United States have additional privileges. That's the fine print right here. They're talking about Guam and the Marianas Islands, etc. But the same kind of incentive goes here from general to advanced to extra. Now here, advanced and extras have the same privileges. Extra gets more frequency at the low end of the 40-meter band for Morse code. This is Morse code down here. This is voice transmission up here. And 20 meters. Again, we see that gap between E, A, and G. Now 10 meters, we have good privileges there, all full privileges, and you can even operate FM. There are FM radio repeaters that live on the 10-meter band above 29.5 megahertz. So frequency modulation can be used above 29.5 megahertz. Well, why? Because its bandwidth is 12 to 15 kilohertz, and it just doesn't fit down below. But above that frequency, then you can use FM. I have worked DX on FM across the Atlantic Ocean, not through a repeater, just direct. But there are also 10-meter repeaters. I put the photo on the right. You remember that a repeater consists of a receiver and a transmitter, and in the middle there's the duplexer, which is a series of cavity filters that help filter out the transmit signal from getting into the receiver. Well, this is just one of the cavities from a 10-meter repeater. And normally you've got 3 to 6 of these cavities. So you can imagine you need a big, tall room in order to put together or put it on its side a 10-meter repeater. There aren't that many out there. All right. Some bands are amateur radio bands exclusively. Some bands are shared bands. And when we share with other licensed services, sometimes we're primary, but sometimes we are secondary. And when we are secondary users, we must protect the primary users, the other users of those frequencies, from harmful interference. We cannot communicate with the primary users. That's not part of our licensing. So if you were to hear another user on the band, especially the 30 and 60 meter bands, those are both shared bands. Well, what happens if a primary user comes up and interferes with you? You have to suck it up, Buttercup. What you have to do is QSY or cease transmission if you are the secondary user on a band. We'll be talking more about propagation as we go along, and knowing about propagation the Northern California DX Foundation has put up around the world beacon stations that operate on the various amateur radio bands. They're automated Morse code transmitters that transmit their call sign for only a certain segment of a minute, for example. And there's a pattern. And if you know the pattern, you can tell which station, and you can listen to the call sign, you can tell which station is transmitting, and you can find out if the band is open to that particular location. So Northern California DX Foundation beacons are around the world. People have marked up their clocks, for example, to listen. This is one of the beacon frequencies, 14.1 megahertz, listening for Morse code for these call signs at these portions of the hour or as you go along. And you can see, oh, I can hear 4U1UN, okay, I'm open there. Or I can hear Hong Kong VR2B, so you know the band is open in that direction. And so there are also beacon aids if you don't want to mark up a clock like this. Ever see these in the old MFJ catalog? I saw them for years and I thought it was a radio receiver. It's not. It's a clock. But its purpose is to synchronize and then tell you which beacon should be transmitting at that moment based on the Northern California DX Foundation schedule. So you still see these at Hamfest. It's kind of neat. You don't need to find one of these, though, if you've got a smartphone. There are apps that you can use for your smartphone. Northern California DX Foundation has one for the Android, for example, and it'll tell you which beacon is transmitting at that instant. So you can be listening on frequency, and there are various frequencies that you can listen on. Now, if you'd like to get into the business of putting up a beacon, you can do it on 10 meters and above. Above 10 meters, the FCC allows U.S. amateurs to operate their own beacon stations. On 10 meters, it's between 28.2 and 28.3 megahertz. And you can do it without any special authorization. The same kind of rules apply. It has to be under automatic control to prevent it from running away and transmitting continuously, for example. And it's limited to 100 watts. But you too can put up your own beacon station. There is a ham here in the area, W4IT, that has a beacon on 6 meters that I use all the time to orient antennas and to adjust antennas for gain. So beacon stations are used for propagation, antenna modeling, that sort of a thing. And remember, I mentioned that broadcast licensees, they use ERP all the time, effective radiated power, whereas ham radio, our power limits are referenced to transmitter or amplifier output power. All right, I want to go back to your technician class. We covered this then, but I want to repeat it here. When is it okay to be a DJ on amateur radio frequencies, meaning when can you play music? The only exception is if you have permission from NASA to broadcast their mission control audio and it happens to contain music. That is the only exception. It has to do with manned space flights. Well, can I broadcast at least? Well, only for Morse code training or for informational bulletins. Broadcasting is considered to be something that could be received by the general public. So Morse code training, yeah. Ham radio informational bulletins. Well, can I retransmit a broadcast? Well, if you get propagation and weather forecast information intended for use by the general public and originated from United States government stations, then yes, you can retransmit that information. Those are the exceptions. Well, Gary, can I at least use secret codes? Can I encrypt my voice? No. The only exceptions are when you're controlling a space station, a satellite in orbit, or a radio controlled device that you wouldn't want somebody else to hack into. Those are the exceptions. But otherwise, you can't use secret codes. Q codes like QRM, QRN, QRP. They're procedural signals. They're well known. They don't obscure the meaning. Most folks know what you're talking about. So these kind of procedural or pro signs may be used as long as they do not obscure the meaning of a message. Otherwise, no encryption is allowed. One of those Q codes, remember, QRP, stands for reduced power or reduce your power. But nowadays we talk about QRP operation. We're typically talking about operating a radio transmitter at 5 watts or less. And yes, you can build a radio transmitter into an Altoids container. This guy's done that. All right, word power. Here's your word of the day: pecuniary. It comes from the 1934 Communications Act, and it points out that amateur radio operators may not make money from their ham radio license. You may not carry messages for hire, for example. If you happen to be a teacher in a high school classroom and you're using ham radio to demonstrate to your students physics and things like that, that's allowed. You can get paid by the school. You're not using your license to make money. But do you want to sell your equipment? Can you do it on the air? Yes, you can. An exception is when you can talk about amateur radio equipment for sale, as long as it really is radio equipment. You're not selling a pickup truck, and you don't do so on a regular basis as a business. So if you owned a $13,000 ICOM IC7851, which the used price right now is $8,000, by the way. They don't sell it new anymore. They just continued it. But yes, you could sell it at the Wednesday night swap and shop at the local repeater. That's allowed. And we mentioned earlier third-party traffic. It's prohibited unless there is a country-to-country agreement between the United States and this other country. And it was surprising to me the countries that are not on this list. Germany, for example, is one. I can talk to a German ham, and the German ham can talk to me, but he can't tell me what his wife says about something, and I can't tell him what my wife says about something, or you know, that sort of a thing. So the full list is here at the URL on the right. The American Radio Relay League maintains the list of third-party traffic countries that we can actually exchange third-party messages with. So the Gambia or Ghana, for example, are okay. Cuba is okay. Canada is okay, but there are other countries that are not. So just before you do it, make sure you check. And it's largely overcome by the internet and technology. Everybody's got WhatsApp or something else. You know, this doesn't apply, but okay. Third-party messages, if you are going to transmit one, must be messages related to amateur radio or remarks of a personal character, or messages related to emergencies or disaster relief. All right, here's a very, very special case, but it's a test question, so we got to talk about it. There's a former ham whose license was revoked. All right, and he comes to you and asks you, hey, can you contact his brother by radio in their home country and pass a message to him? No. Any amateur radio operator whose license was revoked may not use amateur radio for any purpose. Well, what if it were your brother who had the message and his license was revoked? No, same deal. So hams with revoked licenses are out. You can't, even if we have a third-party agreement. All right? Thinking about putting up a radio repeater? It's not that hard. You can do it, but I want to caution you, get it coordinated. Coordinated? You mean falling down the stairs? No. Coordinated in frequency. Before you put a radio repeater on the air, you want to make sure that the frequency is clear, both the input frequency and the output frequency that you might use for the radio repeater. And the best way to do that, you say, well, I'm listening and I don't hear anything. No, that's not enough. You need to go to your local repeater coordination organization. Here in South Carolina, it's the Southeastern Repeater Association. And if you go to their website, for example, they'll tell you how to coordinate a repeater. It's easy. You just contact them, tell them where, latitude and longitude, you want to put up a repeater, and the band you want to put it up, and the height of the tower, for example, and they'll probably give you a frequency pair that you can use. And then your repeater is coordinated. What does that buy you? If you have a coordinated repeater and somebody interferes with your repeater and they're uncoordinated, they have to go away. If you put up a repeater and it's uncoordinated and you interfere with somebody else, you have to go away. So it's always best to do this ahead of time. Now, cross-band repeaters are another thing. You can set up a cross-band repeater sometimes in your car with the dual-band radios, but there are dedicated cross-band repeaters. So there is a question: can a 10-meter repeater retransmit the 2-meter signal of a licensed technician in the 10-meter band above 29.5 megahertz? Why are they asking this question? A technician class operator does not have frequency privileges above 29.5 megahertz. There's a very limited window that technicians have on the 10-meter band, 29.3 to 29.4. No, 28.3 to 28.4, sorry. So technically, if he's transmitting into a repeater using 2 meters, where a technician does have full privileges, but his signal's coming out on 10 meters, isn't he violating the law? No. As long as the control operator of the 10-meter repeater has a general class license or above, because the repeater control operator license takes precedence there. So a crossband repeater from 2 meters to 10 meters could be used by a technician licensee. We always try to avoid making interference to anyone else, whether they're licensed or unlicensed. Certainly when hams are secondary users in a band, we have to protect the primaries. When we're within 1 mile of an FCC monitoring station, we need to watch our transmissions because we could overload some of their measurement and monitoring equipment. And the third is when we're using spread spectrum emissions. All of these require taking special steps to avoid harmful interference. And when I first saw this question a few years ago, I said, well, I want to know where are the FCC monitoring station locations? And so as near I can tell, they're still all up and active. There was one in Adrian, Michigan, which I got a chance to visit one time, a very fascinating place to see. The nearest one to us here is in Powder Springs, Georgia. So if you happen to get near an FCC monitoring station, or you think you would, make sure, just keep in mind that if you transmit within 1 mile of them, they might come and find you, because that's not allowed. That's not good form. We try to protect them. Spread spectrum, Gary, that's pretty elaborate. I don't think I could ever get involved in that. You're doing it right now. In your house with Wi-Fi. Wi-Fi is a spread spectrum technology. And it's, interestingly, the 2.4 gigahertz Wi-Fi band, channels 1 through 8, are also in an amateur radio band, the 13 centimeter band. So you're already using spread spectrum technology in your house, and you may not have realized it. And what spread spectrum does, on the top is a normal transmission or a single frequency carrier. So here's your transmission you're making, and here's the interference that comes in on top of you, and what is received is only the interference, all right? Spread spectrum takes that energy and spreads it out over a wider range, not all at the same time necessarily. It could be time division, so it's frequency hopping or phase modulated or somewhere. And if you get interference in that case, Well, some of the data will get through, and with forward error correction and redundancy, the data will get through. I found this interesting as well. For the 2.4 gigahertz band, they say you've got 11 channels that you can choose from, but look, they overlap. So really, there are only 3 channels in the 2.4 gigahertz band on your 2.4 gigahertz router. So really, if you want to set them up and not be interfered with by anyone else's Wi-Fi, your choices are channel 1, channel 6, and channel 11. Otherwise, you may end up getting some interference from others. That's not on the test, but that's just interesting information. So Wi-Fi, you think, would be universal worldwide, but it's not. It is an unlicensed signal, part 15 in the United States. But the output power on 2.4 gigahertz varies by country. In Europe, the standard is 100 milliwatts. So no more than 100 milliwatts. Now, okay, that makes sense. There's probably a population density in Europe greater than there is in the United States, but okay. In the US, for an unlicensed Wi-Fi router, 1,000 milliwatts, also known as 1 watt, is the limit. With a ham radio license, however, and an amplifier, you could increase that up to 10 watts with a caveat. You have to be running custom software in the Wi-Fi router that will make sure that you do not link it to the public internet directly. You can't connect with an unlicensed Wi-Fi device with your licensed device, because primary and secondary users. So can we communicate with unlicensed Wi-Fi devices? No. But you can set up your own independent network. And hams do that every day. It's called mesh networking, and you can do a Google search on that, and we talk more about it in the extra class as well. More restrictions. This is rules and regulations. So at the moment, there are no banned countries. There are no prohibitions on contacting any country from the United States. North Korea and Yemen have, to the best of my knowledge, no licensed hams, although Yemen may be changing. There have been de-expeditions recently to Yemen, so I may have to change this slide. Countries in the Middle East have in the past had restrictions on contacts with Israel, for example. So I always remember I was listening on a DX frequency and a station in Egypt was the DX. And he was being called by a station from Israel, 4x4 something, something, something. And he kept getting called by the Israeli station. And he knew that his host country, didn't allow him to talk to them. So he handled it very well. He said, well, if I heard a 4x4 station, I'm not allowed to call him. And if I did not hear him very well. He certainly wasn't 5 and 9, and so I cannot acknowledge the transmission of the 4x4 station, which essentially he did. Well, anyway, countries notify the International Telecommunications Union if they wish to restrict contacts. So that's where this comes from. All right, more questions. On which HF and or medium frequency amateur bands are there portions where general class licensees cannot transmit?
Charlie.
80, 40, 20, and 15. The old timers bands, yes. On which of the following bands is phone operation prohibited?
Bravo.
That's 30 meters, yep. All right, and on which of the following bands is image transmission prohibited?
Bravo.
Also 30 minutes, yes, 30 meters again, because image is voice, tones. Which of the following amateur bands is restricted to communication only on specific channels rather than frequency ranges?
Delta.
Yeah, 60 meters, 5 megahertz. So on which of the following frequencies are general class licensees prohibited from operating as control operator? Yeah, you'd have to maybe take a look at your color chart to catch this. But it is alpha, yes indeed, 7.125 to 7.175. Which of the following applies when the FCC rules designate the amateur services as secondary?
Charlie.
Yeah, amateur stations must not cause harmful interference and must accept interference from primary users. On which amateur frequencies in the 10-meter band may stations with a general class control operator transmit CW emissions?
Delta.
It is delta, actually. The general class control operators have full privileges in the 10-meter band. And CW can be transmitted anywhere, even up in the phone portion, by the way. I didn't emphasize that, but CW is always a viable mode. All right, which HF bands have segments exclusively allocated to amateur extra class licensees?
Bravo. Bravo.
Again, the old timers bands 80, 40, 20, and 15. Which of the following frequencies is within the general class portion of the 15-meter band?
Charles.
So this is actually an easy one if you know the 15-meter band is what frequency range. So if you took 300 and divide by 15, it's the only 15-meter frequency up here is C, 21,300 kilohertz. All right, what portion of the 10-meter band is available for repeater use?
Delta.
Delta, above 29.5 megahertz, because repeaters use FM traditionally, and so that's a wide bandwidth signal. So it has to be above 29.5. So when general class licensees are not permitted to use the entire voice portion of a band, which portion of the voice segment is available to them?
Bravo.
Yep.
Bravo. The upper frequency.
The upper frequency portion. Bravo, indeed, yes. And with which of the following conditions must beacon stations comply?
Alpha.
Yeah, no more than one beacon station may transmit in the same band from the same location. Which of the following is a purpose of a beacon station? Observation of propagation and reception. Which of the following transmissions is permitted for all amateur stations?
Charlie.
You can retransmit weather and propagation forecast information from U.S. government stations. So that is allowed. Which of the following one-way transmissions are permitted?
Bravo.
Morse code practice. Yep, transmissions to assist with the learning of the international Morse code. What are the restrictions on the use of abbreviations or procedural signals in amateur service?
Bravo.
They may be used if they do not obscure the meaning of a message. Very good. When is it permissible to communicate with amateur stations in countries outside the areas administered by the FCC?
Alpha.
Not alpha.
Alpha.
It is Bravo. When the contact is with amateurs in any country except those whose administrations have notified that the ITU that they object. All right. And the ARRL will keep us posted if there's any of those. So on what HF frequencies are automatically controlled beacons permitted?
Delta. Delta.
without prior authorization, because obviously the Northern California DX Foundation has them on different frequencies. But here, you could put one up from 28.2 to 28.3 megahertz. So what is the power limit for beacon stations?
Charlie.
100 watts, typical transmitter or transceiver output. Which of the following would disqualify a third party from participating in sending a message via an amateur station? If they had a license and it's been revoked, they're out of amateur radio. So, yep. When may a 10-meter repeater retransmit the 2-meter signal from a station that has a technician class control operator?
Delta.
If the 10-meter repeater control operator holds at least a general class license, then it's A-OK. And which of the following conditions require a licensed amateur radio operator to take specific steps to avoid harmful interference? Read carefully.
Delta.
Alpha is correct. Bravo is correct. Charlie is correct. So delta is the answer. So what are the restrictions on messages sent to a third party in a country with which there is a third party agreement?
Charlie.
They must relate to amateur radio, remarks of a personal character, or messages related to emergencies or disaster relief. That's the kind of messages that you can carry. So in what part of the 2.4 gigahertz band may an amateur station communicate with non-licensed Wi-Fi stations?
Delta.
Yeah, no part. You can't do it. No, 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 no. So why should an amateur operator normally avoid transmitting on 14.1, 18.11, 21.15, 24.93, and 28.2 megahertz?
Alpha.
We only looked at 14.1, but yeah, that's where the beacons live. A system of propagation beacon stations operate on those frequencies. So when may third-party messages be transmitted via remote control? They're assuming the transmitter's in the United States. Alpha. Under any circumstances in which third-party messages are permitted by FCC rules. All right, great job. All right, last section, section 3.4, technical rules and standards. Yeah, go ahead.
I have a question, if we have just a moment.
Sure.
Question Golf 1 Alpha 11. It says when general class licenses are not permitted to use the entire voice portion of the band.
Yeah, it's in the upper right. They're talking about here. No, the upper frequency part. Upper frequency part. Upper. You're breaking up, and I can't. I'm sorry, I couldn't understand the question.
Wouldn't the lower portion be more? Wouldn't the lower portion be juicier and better to use?
But you're not authorized to use that as a general class operator. That's where the gap is. We looked at the gap, remember? Yeah, so what they're trying to do, they're pointing out that as a general class operator, when you can operate, you have to operate in the upper portion of the band allocation as it corresponds with the color chart. Take a look at it. Send me an email if you need more explanation on that, but appreciate you. All right, section 3.4, the last section. Let's do it. So when you build your station and put it all together, of course you want to do the best job you possibly can, but we have a word for it. We want you to use good engineering practice and good amateur practice when you're putting your station together so that it's safe and operates efficiently without causing harmful interference. And who decides if you've used good engineering practice and good amateur practice? It's the FCC. And the FCC has, as we pointed out before, the Part 97 rules. One of those rules is their general one, which is to please use only the minimum power necessary to carry out the desired communication. So if you think 100 watts is going to do it, well, then just use 100 watts. But for DX contacts around the world, well, you may need, especially depending on band conditions, full legal limit, 1,500 watts. And you get that, there is no 1,500 watt radio. You take a radio and you take the RF out from that radio into an amplifier. And so to get to 1,500 watts, you need a radio frequency amplifier. And just this is an information slide here. There are two ratings on amplifiers: continuous commercial service and intermittent and amateur service. Continuous commercial is what it says. That amplifier could output that 1,500 watts all day long without breaking a sweat. The intermittent commercial and amateur service means they assume a 50% duty cycle, that it's going to be on half the time and then off half of the time. Alpha amplifiers, which is no longer in business, but they used to go to Hamfests, have their amplifiers, and put the brick on the key, and then let the amplifier go for the entire Hamfest. That was their proof that their amplifiers were good enough for continuous commercial service, whereas other amplifiers were not built as rugged and would overheat. So that's what we're talking about here. Now, there are exceptions. Most of the time, when you get your general class license on the HF bands, you can operate up to 1,500 watts. The exceptions, as we noted earlier, 60 meters, 100 watts PEP to a dipole, and 30 meters. The 5 megahertz band, you're limited to 200 watts PEP. And we're not going to go into the math. We do that in the extra class. But when we're talking about amplifier power, and peak envelope power has to do with modulation, has to do with modulated signals. AM signals, single sideband, and even Morse code are considered modulated signals. And so we deal with PEP. And so you measure 1,500 watts by using the average power of one complete RF cycle at the peak. You measure peak-to-peak volts. You divide that by 2. You multiply that by 0.707 to get to RMS. Then you square that and divide it by the impedance, which is 50 ohms. And that's how you get to calculating 1,500 watts out. You don't have to do that on the test. I just include that to scare the bejeever, no, to help you with some additional information. This changed this year, but the test didn't change. So I'm going to continue to teach you what the test is going to ask you here. So for digital communications on the high frequency bands, below 10 meters, the rule was that the symbol rate had to be 300 baud or less. And this caused a problem because technology has advanced. Remember the old telephone modems, if you're old enough? We started out at 300 baud, and then they advanced the modems, and 1,200 baud, oh yeah, 2,400 baud, oh yeah, 33K, whoa, 56, which was the theoretical maximum. I don't know if anybody ever got to 56, but okay, the modems were sold that way. The technology got better. The coding got better. The way that they modulated the signals got better. But the rules that are in the test, for example, say that the maximum baud rate below 10 meters is 300 baud. At 10 meters, it goes up to 1,200. Then 6 and 2 meters, it goes up to 19.6. And then 56K, and then above that, there is no limit. Now, why did it change? What am I talking about? Well, Pactor 4, specifically, the fourth generation of a modulation mode called Pactor. Come back to me just for a second, Bruce. Very efficient in passing data. And it actually has a baud rate higher than 300 baud, but it occupies no more bandwidth than a 300 baud signal would. And so the ARRL petitioned the FCC and said, hey, you know, you're out of touch. And in disaster relief, for example, Puerto Rico, when they had a hurricane, the ARRL sent teams down to Puerto Rico and got specific exemptions from the FCC to be able to allow Pactor 4 to be used on amateur radio bands, like on the 20-meter band. And its baud rate was higher than 300 baud, but its bandwidth was no greater. And so now the rules have changed to specify bandwidth, but I'm not going to tell you more than that. I just want you to know that that does exist. But this is what we want to talk about. So the maximum symbol rates, again, below 10 meters, 300 baud, 10 meters, 1200 baud, 6 and 2 meters, 19.6, 1.25 and 70 centimeters, 56K, and above that there are no limits for digital data modes. Now, I'm going to bestow the most popular digital mode award on FT8. This came along while we were teaching classes just a number of years ago. Originally developed WSJT software in 2001, but I think it was like 2006 or something, 7, that FT8 came along. I don't remember exactly. But before that time, other digital modes were the most popular, but when FT8 came along, it took off. And it was developed by Joe Taylor, Steve Frank, and Bill Somerville. It was originally used, the WSJT software, for meteor scatter on VHF, so MSK 144. But then they developed other families of digital data, and so FT8 came along. And so here's a background article on the software, and here's what it looks like running on a computer. And they did a lot of work. I mean, Joe Taylor, the JT of WSJT, is a Nobel Prize winning physicist. He's not a dummy. And so they came up with a way. How it works is to trade time for signal strength. So it listens for 15 seconds and then transmits for 15 seconds. Have I got that right? Yeah. So what happens, it can listen to signals that are down at or below the noise floor. And when it does that during the time 5 years ago when the sunspots were gone and the bands were largely dead, this mode would get through. It used the power of the computer, so that was, you know, a wonderful thing, and it's since taken off and been extremely possible. There are all sorts of variations on FT8 as well. I won't go into. What you need to know, what Joe Taylor and Steve Frank and Bill Somerville did, is that they were developing a new communications protocol. And what they did was they wrote about it. You saw the article there about the new mode and the standards to be used. They publicly documented the technical characteristics of the mode. Then they enabled peer review and comment to come forward, and they've continuously improved the software and the mode all along. And other people have taken up the torch and are developing their own forks for the software as well. So there was FT8, and then later on FT4 was developed more contesting oriented with a shorter time window, 7.5 seconds instead of 15 seconds. It would transmit for 7.5 seconds, listen for 7.5. So that's all we're going to talk about digital modes tonight, but just know that when people are talking digital nowadays, they tend to be talking FT8. All right, last section of questions. So who or what determines good engineering and good amateur practice?
Alpha.
Not you, not the IEEE, not the ITU, but the FCC. What is the maximum transmitter power an amateur station may use on 10.140?
Alpha.
That's one of the exceptions, and that's 200 watts PEP for the 10 megahertz. And what is the maximum transmitter power an amateur station may use on the 12-meter band?
Yeah, that's far. That's NVDs.
1500, so it'd be Charlie.
Yeah, 1500, 12 meters is, there's no restrictions, so yep, you can use full legal limit there. Trick question, kind of. What is the maximum bandwidth permitted by FCC rules for amateur stations transmitting on USB frequencies in the 60-meter band?
Alpha.
Yeah, 2.8 kilohertz. And what is the limit for transmitter power on the 28 megahertz band?
Charlie.
Yeah, 10 meters, general class operator, you can operate up to 1500 watts, legal limit. Remember that 30 meters and 60 meters are the ones with the restrictions. All right, what is the limit for transmitter power on the 1.8 megahertz band? D, he said. You agree? Yeah.
Yes.
The 1.8 megahertz band is also known as the 160 meter band. It's just above the medium wave broadcast band. And yes, you'll need all 1,500 watts to get out. But yes, there's no power limits on that band.
I have a question.
Yes.
So I know we're going through the chapter right now, but a lot of us are kind of bombing through these. I mean, we're kind of like going blank. Is this part of the math, or is this something that we have to memorize?
Just know that the only power restrictions for a general class operator are on the 30 meter and the 60 meter bands. Other than that, know that the legal limit for a general class operator is 1,500 watts. Knowing those things, you can come up with the right answers to these questions. What they're trying to do is to see if you understand that.
You got to memorize the megahertz that go with the frequency.
Yeah, you're going to want to look at the color chart and get familiar with the bands, and that's why we want you to listen on the bands. Because listening on the bands will give you, oh, this band is active during the day. Oh, this band is active during the night. Oh, okay, and you'll start to say, okay, 40 meters, 7 megahertz, yeah. 20 meters, 14 megahertz. It'll just become second nature. All right, let's carry on. What must be done before using a new digital protocol on the air? If you're going to develop one, yeah, you have to publicly document the technical characteristics. That's one of the things, yep. So what is the maximum symbol rate permitted for radio teletype or data transmitted on frequencies below 28 megahertz? How slow can you go? Yeah, 300 baud. Yeah, below 10 meters, it's 300 baud. And what is the maximum power limit on the 60 meter band?
Bravo.
Charlie.
Charlie. This is the 100 watts and a dipole. So remember, 30 meters and 60 meters are the two bands with restrictions. And what is the maximum symbol rate permitted for data on the 10 meter band?
Charlie.
That's the dividing line. So you have 1,200, and then it goes up. What measurement is specified by FCC rules that regulate maximum power? What measurement?
Delta.
Yeah, it's peak envelope power output from the transmitter. And what is the maximum PEP output allowed for spread spectrum transmissions?
Bravo.
Yes, that's 10 watts. We talked about that. And what is QRP operation?
Bravo.
Low power. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of Chapter 3. You made it. I know it's a lot of information to take in and to get going, but we did it. Now we can do a class chat. We've got some time here. Let me go ahead and remove the spotlight. so that folks, I can see folks a little better here. Any questions or comments?
So, we talked earlier about trying to figure out, wavelength versus the, and it seems like, for me anyway, using that circle with 300, the frequency and the wavelength, helps me kind of narrow that down, because you read this stuff and it all talks about the band, or the band talking about.
Yeah.
So I can get really close to the band by using that formula. And so, to me, that's kind of the way I look at it is, if, I know these rules are by the different bands, but when you throw a frequency at me, it's like, whoa, what? And so rather than try to remember the frequencies associated with each band, I just fall back to that formula.
Right. Excellent. That's why I included it, to give you a tool in your arsenal.
Well,
Yeah.
it's one less thing to try to cram in with everything else. I mean, there's some elements in here that you just have to remember. But
Right.
you don't necessarily have to remember.
And these are the approximate wavelengths. These are approximations when we talk 40-meter band, 80-meter band, et cetera. That's giving you, when you do the formula, the actual wavelength. So there's going to be some discrepancies, but
But you get pretty close, and usually, given your choices, you can very quickly drop out ones that are obviously not.
correct.
Over time, it'll be an automatic association as you become more experienced, but the 300 trick is perfect for the test.
I'm not sure Dave's mic was on.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, good. Anyone else?
This mic was turned down really low.
Oh, mine was low?
Yeah, that's why I said.
All right, check. Yeah, it does seem low. Okay. All right, that's better now.
Hey, did you guys read my comment in the chat?
Might have missed it. What
Who
was
holds the partial patent for spread spectrum?
Eddie Lamar.
Oh, that's right, Hedy Lamarr, yeah, and her husband, I can't think of his name now.
George Campbell.
Yeah, so yeah, yep. She originally developed it for guidance of a torpedo, as I remember, but
Yeah, radio-guided torpedoes. That's what my dad used to do.
cool.
I have weird ashtrays with torpedo pictures on them. But your picture really emphasizes and shows. It's a really good graphical representation. As soon as I saw that, it makes it so easy to describe what they did.
Yeah, they were trying to avoid being interfered with, so that
They were trying to avoid jamming. And
exactly.
so you had your interference, which is jamming, and then you had the spread across it. I thought that was really cool.
Yeah.
So just,
And we talk more about it and more in depth in the extra class. So.
Gary, are you going to talk about what we need to say for next week in chapter 4?
Yes, I'm going to turn it over to Dave right now. Go ahead and do that.
We'll do that. Okay, chapter 4 we're going to cover in 2 weeks, and there's 7 sections. There's 7 sections in chapter 4. We're going to be going through the first 3 sections next week. If you care to note it, the break is on page 4-20 in our book. That's when section 4.4 starts. This will be in an email I'll send to you, but usually my email doesn't get out for a couple days, so if you want to get started right now, work on sections 4.1 through 4.3. And since we're talking about that, the book is fairly dense. They go through, packed, I should say, with especially for decibel calculations. You really don't need to do any of those, so don't get too hung up. If you're mathematically inclined and you want to work through all of that, more power to you. Be happy for you to do that, but you won't actually need to do any of those calculations for any of the exam questions. I'll be sharing that and other shortcuts as we go through chapter 4. So it's not as intimidating as it might look when you first read it. Don't panic.
Thank you.
Yep.
Alrighty, y'all. Well, we did it. So go get your brain cooled down. You did great. We'll say 73.
Thank you.
And see you next week.
Good night.
73.
that's it for